We're going to stick with politics for a bit here now. Sir Keir Starmer, let's look at what's happening in the Labour Party. He's facing an internal revolt after outrage from members of his own party over his stance on the war between Israel and Hamas. The Labour leader's faced criticism in recent weeks after he appeared to suggest that Israel's decision to withhold water and power from Gaza was proportionate and justified. Well, as a result of that interview, 23 councillors quit the party. Well, let's just remind ourselves of that interview and what Keir Starmer said.
Israel must have that, does have that right to defend herself, and Hamas bears responsibility.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water? Sir Keir?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law.
Right, since that, Keir Starmer has clarified what he said, saying, "I made it clear it is not and has never been my view that Israel had the right to cut off water, food, fuel or medicines. International law must be followed." Well, a fresh row kicked off this week over his visit to an Islamic centre. Starmer claims that he went to hear from the Muslim community about Palestine, but they dispute that. They say that his social media post after the visit gravely misrepresented his visit. Well, he sought to ease tensions yesterday by meeting Muslim MPs who were left angered by the pattern of behaviour at the top of the party. They called him to call for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Well, in a moment, we're going to speak to two of those councillors who've decided to quit the Labour Party. But first, let's speak to Peter Edwards now, former editor of Labour List, who can try and unpack all of this for us. Peter, thank you so much for your time. Can you just sort of... I've tried my best to do it there, but it's really complicated what's happened, and there's sort of nuance in what Keir Starmer did and didn't say. What is it that people are so angry about, and how have Keir Starmer's efforts to sort of smooth the tensions over gone so far?
Well, I think he's reached out to the Muslim and Jewish community, both among the general public and in Parliament over the last few days, which has been a good thing. But as you alluded to, it all goes back to those appalling terrorist attacks in Israel just came up 2 weeks ago, first loss of the Holocaust, and then the bombing of Palestine, where with great sadness and distress, we know that Palestinian civilians are dying every day. So Keir Starmer was challenged, and he did stumble over his words a little bit, and then he had that clarification. He felt that water and power should be turned on for the people of Palestine, because obviously there's ordinary civilians doing ordinary things, as well as folk in hospital. I think the criticism was that perhaps he was a bit slow to do that, but I think he's probably ended up in the right place after a difficult couple of days of ensuring utilities are supplied to Palestine, calling for a humanitarian corridor. And there's that phrase being used by lots of heads of state at the moment about a humanitarian pause to allow aid in, and then continuing to meet Labour and Jewish voters around the country. So it's been a tough couple of days, but I think after a little bit of difficulty, he's probably ended up in the right place.
I mean, how serious could this get for Keir Starmer? The Times is reporting that it could be about 4 shadow cabinet ministers threatening to resign.
Well, first of all, I mean, in a situation like this, a crisis in the Middle East where lives have been lost, you kind of want to take ordinary Westminster politics out of it. And I think actually the public appreciate when people do that. The events in the Middle East are so awful that they want kind of leaders to act like leaders. And I think he is trying to do that. And to be fair, I think Rishi Sunak's trying to do that as well. In terms of the parliamentary party, you've had 0 resignations and 29 councillors resign, but that's out of a total of more than 6,000. So that's fewer than 1%.
Peter, hold right there if you can, because I'd like to take this opportunity to speak to some of the councillors who have quit the party after Starmer's comments. Councillor Dr Ammar Latif and Councillor Mona Ahmed are both here. Mona, we'll start with you if we can. Oh, sorry, we don't have Mona. I'm so sorry, Ammar. Explain to all of us exactly why it is that you've decided it is not possible for you to continue your role in the Labour Party.
Hi there, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. So yeah, along with the rest of the world, but also many of your viewers, we've watched in horror as the events have unfolded in Israel and Palestine, first with the killing of innocent civilians in Israel, and then, as your previous speaker said, the constant bombardment that's been going on in Palestine. And as you correctly showed that video of Keir Starmer's interview on LBC just over 2 weeks ago now, when he made those statements, we saw urgent clarification from the local and national leadership about those comments, and unfortunately no clarification was forthcoming. The context is important. This statement was made on the same day that the Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, went on Newsnight, and she seemed to try and justify how collective punishment could be within international law. We also then had David Lammy, another shadow frontbencher, who again on national TV tried to justify how collective punishment could be within international law. Now, all the international experts on international laws make it very clear collective punishment is not justified within international law, and it's good to hear that Keir Starmer has now moved to that position which the rest of us held from the start. So I couldn't with good conscience remain in a party where the leader had such disregard for human life and international law. I welcome his clarification, although if you look at his new statement, it's not really, he seems to say, I wasn't answering the question that I was asked, when clear on the video that you've showed he was clearly answering that question. I think the problem now is that because he's been so reckless with his words, actually he now needs to go further. You know, if it was just a simple misspeak, I think he could have made that clarification on the day, and that may have gone a long way. It took him 9 days to issue that clarifying statement. So I think he now needs to go further. He now needs to hold his hands up. He now needs to admit that he made a mistake and apologize for that mistake. But he does need to go further in terms of what's happening in the Middle East. You know, we are seeing now innocent Palestinians continue to die, and it's not enough, I'm afraid, to call for a humanitarian pause. We now need a ceasefire which can bring an end to the bloodshed that's going on.
Yeah, you've made your views really clear. One of your colleagues also decided to resign, Councillor Mona Ahmed, who's also with us. Mona, from your perspective, we sort of just heard from Amar there. What does Keir Starmer have to do, or what does the Labour Party have to say for you to say, OK, actually, I can rejoin this?
Well, I think it's important to note that from the outset, Keir Starmer has joined in a chorus of dehumanisation of Palestinian people. There's been a disturbingly one-sided support for Israel in its right to self-defence, going so far as to suggest that they would be entitled to breaching humanitarian law or committing war crimes in their fight to self-defence. So at this point, the only way that Keir Starmer can row back on this is actually just to apologise. Up until now, he has not given an apology for the way he misspoke during the LBC interview. He went so far as to deny what he had initially said rather than apologise for it. But I think the crucial thing now is for him to recognise the scale of the suffering and the atrocities now that are being meted out on Palestinian people, and to do the only reasonable thing, which is to call for a ceasefire. UN agencies now have warned that Gaza is on the brink of a mass ethnic cleansing event. So this is extremely serious. We've got a very small area, extremely densely populated, that has been subjected to indiscriminate bombing, with 2,500 children at least who've been killed. There is absolutely no justification for this. If there is humanitarian law, it has to be applied universally. It's absolutely right to condemn the killing by Hamas, no question there. But that condemnation has to be on both sides. We are seeing an enormous body count now of innocent Palestinian civilians, and that has to stop. Yeah. And the only way to do that is to call for a ceasefire, to allow in humanitarian aid, and to begin a negotiated settlement that honours Palestinians' right to life.
Yeah, listening to both of your arguments still is Peter Edwards, the former editor of Labour List. Peter, how likely is it that the views and the concerns that we've just had from Amar and Mona are going to be heard from the Labour Party? And do you think there'll be anything further than the clarification we've already heard from Keir Starmer?
Well, I thought Amar and Mona spoke very fluently. We got slightly differing perspectives, but I can understand the distress they're articulating. I thought Darren Jones, the Shadow Cabinet Minister, put it quite well when asked if he wanted to see a ceasefire. And he said, well, we all want the fighting to stop. immediately, as soon as possible. It's very hard to get to that stage when there's around about 200 or slightly more than that Israeli hostages still being held. So you can understand why Israel has taken the stance that it has. And in terms of Keir Starmer, I just repeat one of the other things that you alluded to earlier, which is he's a barrister. He was the most senior prosecutor in the country. He has said that international law must be followed by everyone all the time. And I think those two key things, recognising that there are hostages, including children and pensioners, and the international law must be followed, perhaps how people in the UK Parliament can come together, because ultimately with around about 1,400 Israelis dead and 5,000 and more dead in Palestine, the death toll is horrific.
Peter, if we are to believe the words that we heard sort of 24 hours ago from Benjamin Netanyahu about the ground invasion that is coming and sort of what he wants to unleash on Hamas and the impact that will have then inevitably on civilians living in Gaza, this situation might get more complicated for the leader of the Labour Party.
Well, I think it will get more complicated for the people in the region, and they've got to be at the front of our thoughts most of all. But this was a point that, according to reports, President Biden seems to have made, that first of all, Israel feels very wounded after the worst loss of life since the Holocaust, so a moment of enormous national distress. Israeli lives would no doubt be lost, as well as many Palestinian lives in a ground invasion. And of course, there's this network of tunnels in Palestine that we know exists, but we don't really know the scale of. And then, of course, there's this fear of the conflict spreading across the region, where, of course, you've not just got residents living their ordinary lives, but you also have lots of Britons, lots of Americans living as well. And obviously, we know that the kind of Israeli troops have been massed for something like 2 weeks now in a state of readiness. So that would suggest that there are some very intense and very speedy talks going on between the British government, the American government, and Israel to try and advise Israel on what it does next, amid a backdrop of, to be frank, immense suffering on both sides.
Exactly, and those tensions we'll be continuing to look at on the programme. Thank you all very much. Peter Edwards, really appreciate your time. Also, Councillor Mona Ahmed, also Dr. Aymar Latif, really appreciate you both coming on and explaining the reasons why you've decided to resign from the Labour Party.